Welcome to WTEW Bible Studies. So I hope you got things cleared up about the rapture. We're going to talk about some other terms that people have all kinds of different definitions for. So for this channel, I'm going to go with these definitions here. Hopefully this will clear things up. So I told you I'd do something about the day of the Lord and the Great Tribulation. This will be that video, and plus it's got a little bit more to it. So we're going to talk about God's wrath, Daniel's 70th week, and terms like that day. We'll start with the day of the Lord. So 23 times. There's not a whole lot of times where the day of the Lord is mentioned. One of them, I didn't know what time they were talking about. 12 of them, God's wrath, during the period of God's wrath. And we'll get into what God's wrath is in a little bit. Four of them, again, these are all day of the Lord. It was talking about King Nebuchadnezzar. So back almost 700 BC, he's talking about when King Nebuchadnezzar took over Israel. Three of them had to do with when the northern kingdom of Israel was defeated and was no longer part of God's kingdom, so taken over by the Assyrians. Two of the times the day of the Lord is mentioned, it's the death day of an individual. The day of the Lord, the day you die, that's the day you meet the Lord. And finally, the last one was the end of creation there. That was in Peter. So that's when the whole heaven and earth goes away. It's called the day of the Lord. So if you think the day of the Lord is one event, it's just not. There's all kinds of things at the day of the Lord. And so some people, there's like 200 plus for that day, thinking they're referring to the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord itself is undefined. So if you're going to say that day refers to the day of the Lord, well, what are we talking about? There's really no way to know. So that day you got to look in context. I did a video not too long ago where that day was actually Pentecost. So that throws another thing into the mix. So we really have to look at what we're defining. There's a lot of similar characteristics when it talks about the day of the Lord. There's an overthrow. A lot of times it's an overthrow of God's people that rejected him, but sometimes it's also a day when God takes care of those people that have been killing his. So at the end of the times, there's going to be a period called the Great Tribulation, and God's wrath will come after that. That's the day of the Lord. That's going to be that day. But in context, it only means that in certain passages. It doesn't mean that everywhere. So the day of the Lord, you got to look at the context to see what it means. That day, you got to look at the context to see what it means. There is no one definition that fits. Let's go with Daniel's 70th week now. So that's defined for us. So Israel was supposed to get punished for 70 years under the Babylonian kingdom, but they did not turn from their ways, their sinful ways. So God extended that. He multiplied their punishment by 7. And that 70 years that they were initially to be punished, they got 490 years. And so the last week is the last 7 years of those. And Israel still has to endure that. Israel's going to turn their back on God, and God's going to punish them for another period of 7 years. And three and a half of those years, they're going to think that life is great. They're going to have a peace treaty. There's going to be somebody that they're going to claim as the Messiah, and he's not going to be their Messiah. But in John 5, he warned them if somebody came in his own name, him you would think was Messiah. So it's not hard to picture a Donald Trump or a Joe Biden or somebody like that coming up with a peace treaty with 10 nations, and the Jews calling that leader the Messiah, whoever puts this peace treaty together. And then during the last 3.5 years, that's the Great Tribulation. So the Great Tribulation has a start that's specific and an end date that's specific. So the 70th week, that's also specific. It'll have a start at the treaty, and it will end when the Great Tribulation ends. So the whole 70th week, that's not the Great Tribulation, because the Great Tribulation starts when the sacrifice stops and the abomination of desolation is set up. So the sacrifice, what is that? The Jews are going to worship on their Temple Mount. They're going to sacrifice a lamb twice a day, just like they did back in Old Testament days. And when that sacrifice is stopped, but it hasn't even started yet, so it's got to start, and then it'll be stopped by an Antichrist character, at least his army. And when that stops, that will mark, that's 3.5 year point. That day starts the period of Great Tribulation that is found in Daniel. That's specifically when the Great Tribulation starts. That's the time of Jacob's trouble. So this is a bad time for Israel. but it's bad for the whole world as well. So the Great Tribulation starts with the end of the sacrifice and the setup of the abomination of desolation. We don't really know what that is. We've got a couple different guesses, and I don't want to guess in this. We're going to specifically define. So when the Jewish sacrifice, the twice daily sacrifice of a lamb is stopped, that's the beginning of the period of Great Tribulation. It goes for exactly 3.5 years. That's described as a time, times, and a half time. We've got 42 months. We've got 1,260 days. All those describe the same period of time, and that's the Great Tribulation. So when does it end? Well, there's a specific thing that happens there too. So if you look in Revelation chapter 11, you'll see two witnesses that will die. 3.5 days later, they'll come back to life. And when they ascend into heaven, that day they ascend, that will be the final day of the Great Tribulation. That's when God intervenes to cut short those days. So the 3.5 years are not going to be cut short. But if they would have kept going, everybody on earth would have died. So God intervenes by showing that God has power over death. And these two witnesses who were the last hope for Israel because they were able to fight against their enemies, when they die, Israel think all hope is lost. But when they come back to life, they will realize that this is the sign of Jesus. This is the sign of their Messiah, mentioned in Matthew 24, 29, and 30. The sign of Jesus, death, resurrection, and ascension of these two witnesses, just like Jesus. That's the last day of the Great Tribulation. That's also the last day of Daniel's 70th week. That's not when Jesus comes. There's still another 75 days of God's wrath. So again, God's wrath throughout the whole Bible, it means different things. But in the book of Revelation, God's wrath is always God pouring out his vengeance on his enemies. So the enemies were killing Christians, killing Jews for the last 3.5 years. And God, now it's time to pour out his wrath. That's 75 days. You'll find those days in Daniel chapter 12. So there's 30 days after the Great Tribulation. That's a period of mourning for the Jews when they realized that, yes, we killed Jesus. Jesus was our Messiah. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. Then God will protect them. This is the time when God's going to pour out his vengeance and kill their enemies. So there's going to be just a myriad of enemies gathered all around them and all around Jerusalem. And God's going to wipe them out. And there's going to be so many dead there that it's going to take months for them just to bury the dead. And that is the period of God's wrath, specifically in the book of Revelation. But just like the day of the Lord, you can't really define it because in the different contexts, there are different things that God means about his wrath. It could mean you're going to hell. It could mean that God poured out his wrath when King Nebuchadnezzar came and took over Israel. So there, again, there's just all sorts of uses for it. But in the book of Revelation specifically, God's wrath, every time you see that mentioned, and it's mentioned over and over in the book of Revelation, that refers to those 75 days that occur after Daniel's 70th week, occur after the Great Tribulation. So don't say the Great Tribulation and include God's wrath in that. Those are two totally separate periods of time, and one follows the other consecutively. The Great Tribulation, 3.5 years, followed by 75 days of God's wrath. Those are all the terms, as you'll find them at least in this channel, and I hope that helps you when you're trying to figure things out there in the book of Revelation, trying to do any prophecy stuff. If you stick with these terms, they'll help you out. Thank you.